On May 18, 2015, during practice for the Indianapolis 500, Aero Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports driver James Hinchcliffe lost control of his car heading into Turn 3. The machine had suffered a sudden right front suspension failure, and the car barreled into the outside wall. Though the machinery had disintegrated, one of the suspension pieces had pierced the cockpit tub, and as a result, Hinchcliffe's thigh. As the Canadian racer likes to say, he was effectively shish kebabbed. Within 30 seconds of the crash, IndyCar's medical crew was attending to James Hinchcliffe. Standard procedure would say to avoid removing the suspension component that had stabbed the driver, but IndyCar's medical crew knew better. The doctors on staff understood that from the amount of blood present, the suspension had struck an artery. Rather than waste any time, the crew cut Hinchcliffe from the car, placed him in an ambulance, and took a police escort to Indianapolis's University Methodist Hospital. 5 minutes later, James Hinchcliffe was being treated at a Level 1 trauma center. Fewer than 10 minutes had passed since he initially lost control of his car, and that speed was critical. Had it taken another 90 seconds for Hinchcliffe to reach care, doctors say he would have bled out. That practice accident was horrifying, but the response was awesome in the purest sense of the word. IndyCar's well-oiled safety crew knew exactly how to respond efficiently to a life-threatening injury and wasted no time making it happen. In the immediate aftermath, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway also improved its trackside facilities. If a similar crash were to happen in 2025, that facility is now stocked with the blood transfusions you'd need to survive bleeding out on track. That was the only reason Hinchcliffe needed to go to the hospital in the first place. IMS had everything else they would have needed to take care of him. But that response didn't occur in a vacuum. It took decades of practice, research, and innovation to come to fruition. And in this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to analyze the exceptional and seemingly impossible growth of the most advanced motorsport medical team in the world. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Studying the history of motorsport safety can be a little bit tricky. Until around the 1960s, safety wasn't considered to be a part of motorsport, and if you were trying to make racing safer, you were probably going to be laughed out of the track. From the very earliest days of town-to-town racing events, there was obviously some thought paid to safety, but it wasn't much. Events initially took place on open roads, but the 1903 Paris to Madrid race featured so many fatalities in the first leg that the event had to be called off. Initial concerns about safety were not actually for the drivers. The folks behind the wheel were assumed to have known the risks of competition and to have accepted them. If a driver was hurt or killed in the race, well, that was just a basic fact of motorsport. In the early 1900s through about the 1960s then, safety in motorsport meant making racing events safer for spectators. Developing purpose-built racetracks to keep fans away from the racing surface, erecting fences in place of hay bales, building grandstands, and more were all different parts of this attempt to make racing safer for spectators. Over time, tracks would hire doctors to attend events or to set up a Spartan medical center staffed by volunteers. There might be an emergency response vehicle or two stationed somewhere around the track, and there were probably marshals staked out to warn drivers of upcoming danger. But the main thing to know about these efforts at making racing safer was that they weren't even concerted efforts. In fact, they were probably the result of a very bad crash that effectively forced the track to do something in order to look like it cared. In Europe, things began to change largely thanks to racer Jackie Stewart and BRM chairman Lewis Stanley. In 1966, Stewart crashed at Spa-Francorchamps while driving for BRM. His car hit a telephone pole and landed upside down in a ditch, where he was trapped for 25 minutes until fellow drivers Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant, who had also crashed, managed to free Stewart with a toolkit taken from a fan. Soaked in fuel and nursing a broken shoulder, Stewart was hauled off to a local barn where the driver stripped off his fuel-soaked clothes and left him on the floor, surrounded by cigarette butts. Some nuns came in to take care of Stewart, and to preserve his decency, redressed him in the very clothes covered in the fuel. Finally, Graham Hill was able to find an ambulance, and off Stewart finally went for adequate medical care. Understandably, Stewart and Stanley were horrified by what happened, and they kicked off Formula One's big crusade for driver safety, which encompassed everything from upgrading trackside containment devices to developing fireproof overalls. But that's a topic for a future episode, so I won't spoil it too much here. Instead, we're going to look at the United States, where safety evolved a little bit differently. Road racing wasn't as big a phenomena in America as it was in Europe, at least not until after World War II. Prior to that, and even after, racing was done largely at oval tracks. Because fans were seated in grandstands at those tracks, they were naturally kept out of the way, if only because it was easier to tell people that they were supposed to be in a grandstand and not anywhere else. The most prominent track in America was obviously the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. There, one of the most robust trackside medical care systems was developed simply because of the nature of the Indy 500. For the entire month of May, drivers from around the country flocked to the track for weeks, putting in hours and hours of practice every day. Part of what made that possible was the fact that there was some level of medical care that could be provided at the track, whether you had an accident or just a standard ailment that might have kept you from being behind the wheel. In 1936, a man named Dr. Thomas Hanna volunteered as a physician at the Speedway, and he remained there for decades. In 1960, he was named medical director of the track, which saw the infield medical facility transformed into basically a hospital. Still, in all of the medical world, the concept of trauma care was still very new. The first manual for treating patients suffering traumatic injuries came during the Civil War in the United States. Basically, President Lincoln wanted to provide a how-to manual for battlefield doctors. But even then, it wasn't until World War II that researchers actually went out into the field themselves to more deeply study what was happening to victims. Researchers documented the initial injuries sustained by soldiers, as well as the care they received and the outcomes that resulted. At the war's end in 1946, it was clear that we needed something like that in America, and the first emergency departments began to open in select hospitals around the country. However, at the time, care was still done by a staff of volunteers. Doctors couldn't really specialize in medical care back then the same way that they could specialize in, say, caring for the heart. Anyone who wanted to take emergency healthcare work was basically forging a new landscape. There were plenty of factors that contributed to the rapid expansion of these emergency care systems, but I think the biggest one was a 1966 study published in the National Academy of Sciences, titled Accidental Death and Disability: The Neglected Disease of Modern Society. That study contended that modern life was advancing at a rapid rate, and that the medical field had not adapted to new problems as quickly as they needed to. The introduction of the U.S. interstate highway system and the development of even faster, more powerful cars had led to an epidemic of traumatic injury on the roadsides. But overall, no one had any idea how to handle those things like a car crash or even a workplace injury. You were basically left fending for yourself. The report summarized several problems and needed conclusions. First, it argued that the general public was absolutely clueless about the true magnitude of things like traumatic injuries, and that millions of people lacked even basic instruction in first aid, which meant that they wouldn't be able to provide life-saving care to an injured person until professionals arrived. Think of things like being able to provide CPR or knowing the Heimlich maneuver to help someone who's choking. We had none of that back then. Even professionals didn't always know how to adequately respond to an injury that had just taken place, and many hospitals lacked the funding, supplies, or space to care for critically injured patients. The report was a huge wake-up call. In its aftermath, the United States created 911, the universal emergency phone number that anyone could dial anywhere in the country to reach a dispatcher who could then connect them to local authorities. Prior to that, you used to have to memorize a local 7-digit number to reach any kind of emergency service, and that was extremely problematic, especially as interstate highway systems linked one coast to another. If you were traveling to another part of the country, you probably didn't know who to call for an emergency. 911 simplified that. In addition, the National Highway Traffic Administration was developed to regulate safety in consumer vehicles. The National Trauma Database was founded to collect data on emergency care and outcomes. Every single state was required to develop an emergency medical services system, and in 1973, a grant helped bolster those EMS systems. In 1976 came the publication of a manual called Optimal Hospital Resources for the Injured Patient, which detailed the way emergencies should be handled, all the way from treatment at the site of the emergency to rehabilitation in its aftermath. In the 1980s, the American College of Surgeons began conducting routine examinations of trauma centers to ensure that they were operating efficiently and up to standard. Let's just put some of these dates into the context of motorsport, starting with 1966. Jack Brabham won the 1966 Formula One World Championship. Jackie Stewart suffered his horrifying crash at Spa. Graham Hill won the Indianapolis 500 in his rookie year, while 11 of the race's 33 starters were wiped out in a first-lap crash. There were no wings on open-wheel race cars, not quite yet. Ford finally came out triumphant over Ferrari at the iconic 24 Hours of Le Mans. David Pearson won the 1966 NASCAR Grand National Series, the first year with mid-sized stock cars at racing's highest level. When the Optimal Hospital Resources for the Injured Patient manual came out in 1976, James Hunt won the Formula One World Championship after his main rival, Niki Lauda, was almost fatally injured in a crash at the Nürburgring. Lauda survived bearing brutal burns on his face and hands as he was trapped in his burning Ferrari after his helmet popped off in the crash. Johnny Rutherford was declared the victor of a range-shortened Indy 500. His win was the last one for Offenhauser engines. Janet Guthrie had become the first woman to enter that race, and IMS Vice President Elmer George was shot and killed during a confrontation after the event. Jackie Ickx and Gijs van Lennep secured the win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, driving a Porsche 936, while Cale Yarborough took his first of 3 consecutive NASCAR championships. But as far as motorsport safety was concerned, it was pretty much the Wild West. Are you tired of the same old boring motorsport merch? Me too. That's why this season, Deadly Passions Terrible Joys is partnering with Homefield Apparel, a sporting apparel company that has released some exceptional collections inspired by the racing world. If you're looking for some great shirts and hats designed right in Speedway, Indiana, head down to the description to learn more about Homefield, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 at checkout to get 15% off your first purchase. In American motorsport, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is the hub for plenty of mind-boggling innovations, but there's a compelling case to be made to say that the introduction of top-notch safety teams and permanent safety facilities is at the top of that list. One of the key players in the legitimization of medical care in motorsport was Dr. Stephen Olvey. Olvey grew up a motorsport fan, attending the Indy 500 for as far back as he could remember, but it wasn't until the late 1960s that he spotted a flyer requesting medical volunteers for the race. As a student in medical school who had been enamored by the greatest spectacle in racing, Olvey volunteered his services and was quickly asked to join the medical team at the track. His first actual race on staff was 1966, and in his autobiography, Rapid Response, Olvey details the very horrific safety standards of the time. There's exactly one ambulance at the track on race day, and it wasn't an ambulance at all. It was a hearse. It had exactly one bottle of oxygen in the back, comprising its safety equipment, and that was it. That was the sum total of rescue equipment available at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in Graham Hill's rookie year. And yes, I'm serious about the hearse. Back then, it was hard to convince an actual ambulance staffed with emergency medical technicians to hang around the racetrack all day. There were rules that dictated where ambulances could go, and those ambulances were also few and far between. No hospital wanted to waste its resources on a car race. It was way easier to enlist the local funeral home's hearse for any emergencies. Remember, this was the mid-60s. Trauma care as a concept had yet to be formalized and legitimized, and in any case, a lot of people had a deeply negative opinion of professional race car drivers to begin with. There was a persistent belief that drivers were stupid, that they were unnecessarily risking their lives to drive fast in circles, and that if they were injured, they were asking for it. And from the side of a race series or track promoter, organizing a ton of emergency equipment and safety upgrades and trained responders is expensive. Outside of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, you'd be hard-pressed to find a track that valued its competitors' lives to the extent that it implemented preventative safety protocols. If the track did have some sort of medical program, it was generally staffed by friends of the promoter or by a slew of completely unprepared volunteers without much medical training, or by an eye doctor, an obstetrician, or even just the guy who cut the grass at the track. The Indy 500 was different thanks to its longevity and its overall pomp and circumstance. By 1966, the event had already accumulated a serious legacy and many of the layers of tradition that persist even today. You were more likely to run into a doctor or a nurse with a keen appreciation of the Memorial Day race in Indianapolis than you were anywhere else, and that affection made it a lot easier to encourage those medical personnel to dedicate their time to the racetrack. At that point, IMS had a dedicated medical director in the form of Dr. Thomas Hanna, who had been one of the pioneers of implementing trackside care centers, despite only being a minor family doctor for the rest of the year. During the month of May, the infield care center was staffed with 20 physicians and a small army of nurses who cared for everything from a fan's heat exhaustion to a driver's nasty accident. The only problem was that no one really knew what to do when treating severe injuries. Dr. Hanna gained a ton of experience simply by having treated everything from broken necks to severe burns moments after they had happened. He developed a great system of trauma care, but none of it was written down, formalized, or shared with other interested doctors in the greater medical community. What made Dr. Hanna's eventual successor, Dr. Olvey, so important was that Olvey took trauma care seriously. He understood that there was a massive difference between what the contemporary medical literature said about treating car crash victims and what he was witnessing at the racetrack, and those differences came down to two things: speed and timing. A race car in qualifying trim is going to be much faster than any road car, which meant crashes in race cars were generally more violent. That's the speed element. But the timing was even more important. At the racetrack, even a hearse full of medical volunteers could respond to the scene of an accident faster than an ambulance of trained professionals could reach the scene of a car accident on the road. Olvey began to realize how important it was to respond quickly, how he and his medical team could transform a critical situation into a stable one within a matter of seconds, all because some doctors began treating a wounded driver within a moment of him having crashed. But again, this was all at IMS. Olvey recalls going to a pretty standard 20-plus car open test with a friend, where he was the only person in attendance who had any kind of medical training, and he wasn't even there as a professional, he was there to hang out with a buddy. When a driver suffered a nasty crash at the track, the only supplies Olvey had to stabilize the driver's neck and back were a dirty bath towel and a discarded wooden door from an old pit building. Olvey reflects on a very important point in his book Rapid Response. How many drivers out there had raced with concussions or fractures because they'd crashed during a test session or a race where no doctors were present? And how many other drivers had been put at risk because of that? As he gained more experience at the track, Olvey started to record the data about his treatments, what he did, how soon he got to the accident, what worked, what didn't, and how the driver rehabilitated in the aftermath. He tried to figure out why an accident injured a driver the way it did, and what could be done to prevent that injury in the future. That accurate and detailed note-taking began to grow into a body of work investigating high-speed trauma care, a discipline that no one was taking seriously at the time. Again, we're talking about the 60s and 70s, an era where cars were built based on what looked fast, because few people were seriously applying aerodynamic engineering principles to race cars. It was an era where the designer of a Formula One car would probably ask you what airplane science had to do with race cars that touched the ground anyway. It was an era where seatbelts were being built into some race cars, but drivers still refused to use them because they believed it was better to be thrown from the car than trapped inside of it in an accident. Fire resistance race suits had been invented and drivers were recommended to use them, but during unofficial test sessions, who who's really going to know that you didn't change out of your street clothes when you got behind the wheel? Times were starting to change, but since no one could provide clear, irrefutable evidence that, say, a monocoque chassis provided an extra shell of protection for the driver inside, or that a full-face helmet was 100% safer than an open-faced one, there are going to be people who just chose not to believe those things. In 1974, a poorly trained medical crew forgot to secure the gurney holding an injured Gordon Johncock, and when the ambulance accelerated, Johncock tumbled out of the back of it. It was enough for Wally Dallenbach to suggest the idea of a traveling medical crew to the president of USAC, which sanctioned IndyCar racing at the time. Dr. Olvey was a natural choice to join that crew after years of dedication and volunteer work at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. By that time, he was a familiar face to many of the drivers, and they knew they could trust him. They also knew that Olvey had their best interests in mind, not just as patients, but as racers. In 1977, Pancho Carter was testing in Phoenix when he lost control of his car and barreled into the aging steel rails that lined the track, crushing his pelvis against a wooden post that held the rails in place. Carter's wife immediately called Dr. Olvey to advocate for his care with the local medical staff, and that's what Dr. Olvey did. He called the hospital and learned that Carter had lost serious amounts of blood, crushed his bones, severed his sciatic nerve, and even ruptured his bladder. While the doctors at the Phoenix hospital didn't exactly throw up their hands in defeat, they did chart a course of care that assumed Carter would give up racing and that he would be largely immobile afterward. But Pancho Carter wanted to race, and he made that clear to Olvey. Olvey instructed him to sign out of the hospital against medical advice and return to Indianapolis. There, Olvey entered him into an intense rehabilitation program that got him back behind the wheel within 3 months. Carter limped to his car at the start of the race at Indianapolis Raceway Park that marked his debut back, and promptly crushed the field to go on to win. After USAC parted ways with a group of disaffected team owners, Olvey joined CART, the championship auto racing teams, as medical director. Here he had the resources and the trust to really up his game. The drivers turned to the CART medical team for assistance when forming the Championship Drivers Association, which was effectively a union that advocated for the rights of the drivers, be that in securing a decent paycheck for an up-and-comer, encouraging tracks to upgrade their facilities, or gathering funds to distribute to the families of injured or dead drivers. It also meant that Olvey could push the science of trackside medical care to its furthest extent, alongside USAC's former medical delegate Steve Edwards. Edwards had designed the concept of a safety truck that was loaded with all the equipment the safety team would need to rescue, revive, and care for a driver, as well as to clean up any messes on the track at the same time. CART fielded 2 safety trucks at its races, staffed by 4 people with varying degrees of medical training or other emergency response training. As the 1980s got underway, Olvey met another man who was critical to the evolving world of motorsport safety, an orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Terry Trammell. At the 1981 Indy 500, Danny Ungais crashed hard exiting Turn 3, and his legs were left sticking out of the front of the car. A safety truck was able to respond to the scene in moments to extricate Ungais and helicopter him off to the hospital, where he was assigned to the care of Dr. Trammell. In the hands of any other doctor, Ungais' injury would have looked so bad as to need an amputation, but Dr. Trammell had recently learned a blood vessel sparing technique that preserved Ungais' limbs and even got him behind the wheel shortly after. That kind of stunning medical care was exactly what Olvey was looking for, and Trammell became one of his closest associates. But in 1982, first Gordon Smiley and then Jim Hickman were killed in racing accidents during CART events, forcing the medical team to really dig into what else it could do to grow the discipline of motorsport trauma care. And that would require introducing the very concept of motorsport trauma care to a wider audience. In 1984, Olvey and Trammell published a study in a less than reputable Physician and Sports Medicine journal, but they were published. There, they reviewed the data they'd accumulated from years of crash response, then published the first crash and injury statistics ever shared in the racing world. There they found something shocking. Orthopedic or bone-related injuries accounted for a whopping 89% of the injuries that Olvey and Trammell treated in their specified time frame. Head injuries accounted for an additional 10% of injuries, and internal damage for less than 1%. That should have been a huge wake-up call for anyone who assumed that all car crash victims, whether in racing accidents or road accidents, could be treated the same. In road accidents, patients' injuries were most likely going to be internal. That's due to the pretty mediocre restraint systems we have in road cars. The 6-point belt in a race car, though, keeps drivers firmly anchored in the event of an accident, so torso injuries or injuries to the organs were really rare. Armed with that information, Olvey and Trammell went to CART to say, hey, the way we're building cars right now is causing serious bone injuries, especially to the feet and ankles of the driver. Is there any way we can redesign the car to pull the driver's feet away from the front of the car, to protect that area better, and to secure the pedals to keep them from causing other injuries? CART's technical committee took that feedback to the engineers of teams and came up with a series of fixes that instantly dropped the number of orthopedic injuries. They strengthened the nose cone, moved the driver further back in the car, and added a bulkhead in front of the driver's feet. Overnight, orthopedic injuries dropped. With that problem solved, Olvey and Trammell next had to consider head injuries, but those are much harder to understand. No driver wants to admit to being cognitively unable to race after taking a blow to the head, and that meant doctors could not address those concerns. Some of the biggest breakthroughs on the head injury front required drivers to self-report. Thankfully, folks like Rick Mears had grown to trust Dr. Olvey's guidance. It was Mears that admitted he and several other drivers had begun to lose consciousness in seemingly minor crashes in the 1980s. No one else knew that, and therefore, no one else could fix the problem and prevent that loss of consciousness from happening. But when Mears came to Olvey, Olvey conducted an investigation, and as it turned out, the problem came from the use of carbon fiber in the cockpit rim. When drivers cracked their heads against the stiff composites, their brain would absorb the impact and leave them unconscious. Before the next race, all cars had energy-absorbing foam lining the cockpit, and the problem vanished. But again, as Olvey stresses in his book, how would anyone have known? How long would the problem have gone on? How many drivers would have suffered unnecessary head injuries before someone finally spoke up? Who would a driver have gone to if he didn't have a trusted medical professional to speak with? And would that person have even taken the driver seriously? Meanwhile, the medical team was making incredible breakthroughs. In 1984, Rick Mears pulverized the bones in his feet in a crash at San Air Speedway, and the local doctors believed the only option was to amputate. Instead, Roger Penske commissioned a plane to fly Mears down to Dr. Trammell in Indianapolis. Trammell used hand surgery techniques to repair Mears's feet, to the extent that he finally recovered, and Mears went on to win an additional 2 Indy 500s. But that kind of surgery had never been done on feet before. It was cutting edge, and it was done in a motor racing environment. At the 1984 Michigan 500, Al Unser Jr. and Chip Ganassi crashed hard, and Chip was left unconscious, unbreathing, and clinically brain dead. But because Olvey had responded to the crash in moments, he was able to administer CPR and secure Ganassi's airway on the spot. Ganassi was able to breathe on his own soon after, and even though he remained unconscious for 10 days, he did wake up. After 2 years of rehabilitation, he was even back to normal. It provided clear evidence of how important it was to get adequate oxygen to the brain immediately after a head impact. If you could get oxygen and maintain adequate blood pressure, you could almost guarantee the driver would not only be able to survive, but also thrive without serious cognitive impact. By the next year, 1985, CART had joined forces with the Horton Ambulance Company, which wanted to build bespoke ambulances jam-packed with all the things a medical crew would need to respond to a racing accident. The initial prototype was hugely influential. The same size as a standard ambulance, it included more lighting for on-the-fly care, splints and bandages to treat orthopedic injuries, state-of-the-art monitors, plenty of fluids and medications for advanced life support, and an expanded airway kit. Several years later, CART upgraded to a medical motorhome designed on a Greyhound bus chassis in order to replace the series' fifth-wheel medical trailer. thus totally transforming the kind of care you could receive at the track. And you could also gain great care off of it, too, thanks to Olvey. During a tire test at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, driver Roberto Guerrero crashed hard and lapsed into a coma with a severe head injury. He wasn't able to breathe for himself and showed signs of a diffuse axonal injury, which results when a shearing force damages the nerves in the spinal column and basically causes the entire nervous system to spiral. Diffuse axonal injuries were almost guaranteed to be a death sentence, but Olvey was given permission by Guerrero's wife to try an experimental therapy that involved dosing the patient with an almost toxic level of barbiturates. By decreasing the metabolism in the brain, the barbiturates could reduce swelling and prevent further damage or death. Within 24 hours of beginning that treatment routine, Guerrero's cranial pressure was back to normal levels, and he woke up 3 weeks later. He only spoke Spanish when he woke up, but he became one of the first patients ever to receive cognitive rehabilitation therapy. Basically, that meant he would spend hours reconnecting his neural pathways by playing computer games, relearning English, and learning how to walk again. After months of hard work, Guerrero could soon drive the family car, play a full round of golf, and even return to racing. He finished second in his kart return. All the while, the medical team kept expanding. While CART did possess a traveling safety team, it also developed training programs to get local volunteer medics up to speed at every racing event. General Motors installed black boxes in certain cars. Those boxes recorded crash data and even allowed GM to create reconstructions of the accident to understand why certain crashes had happened, which also allowed the medical team to figure out why certain injuries took place. The medical crew was able to develop a well-equipped hauler full of medical equipment with permanent beds for serious injuries and a waiting room for patients. After all, Olvey and Trammell were so beloved that many of the non-racing folks in the kart world went to them when they had any other ailment, including common colds, minor injuries, broken bones, or even just family care. That hauler offered 850 square feet of air-conditioned space, an x-ray machine, a ventilator, a blood diffuser, and so much more. The $1 million hauler offered 850 square feet of air-conditioned space, an x-ray machine, a ventilator, a blood diffuser, and so much more. The CART medical crew even helped engineers build better race seats, install more head protection in the cockpits, and plenty of other things, all by analyzing data and not by needing to witness a nasty crash first. That was all taking place in the late 1990s. In 20-odd years, safety in racing had evolved on a rapid basis thanks in large part to the works of Drs. Olvey and Trammell, and it meant that drivers were retiring from old age, not because they sustained a career-ending injury. People were actually taking the medical motorsport information seriously, and it was having an impact. Of course, there was still work to be done. In 1999, Gonzalo Rodriguez suffered a fatal basilar skull fracture at Laguna Seca. 3 weeks later, Greg Moore died of massive head injuries when he crashed at Fontana. In the aftermath came the mandatory usage of the HANS, or head and neck protection system, that secures a driver's head to his torso to prevent those shearing forces in the spinal column. Around the late 90s and early 2000s, the FIA's Medical Commission, headed by Dr. Sid Watkins, soon began to meet up with the International Council of Motorsport Sciences. Those two organizations had been individually founded to further safety in motorsport, but by combining, the best minds in medicine could get together and discuss changes in motorsport safety from various angles. And everyone had a hand, whether you were a physician, or a driver's trainer, or even a biomedical engineer. Those different experts together could develop care plans for injured drivers or in-car safety systems, and all of it included feedback from a wide variety of sources, so you were never really lacking in any one discipline. That was huge. In just a few decades, American open-wheel racing's tracks had been transformed from roughshod arenas of death and injury to well-staffed and well-trained medical centers. If you had a heart attack at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, you would get better and faster care at the track than you would have gotten if you'd had your heart attack at home. Care had grown proactive, not reactive, and it had evolved even further to develop health baselines for drivers that analyzed their mental and physical capabilities before they ever got in a car. That meant that after an accident, they would go through those same tests, and it would be easy to tell what impact the crash had by comparing the post-crash results to the baseline. In rapid response, Olvey treats one specific incident as a kind of centerpiece for the book: Alex Zanardi's 2001 crash at the Lausitzring. Thanks to the quick response of the medical team, Zanardi managed to survive his horrific injuries. He did require amputation of both legs in order to do so, but he didn't die from that process either. However, that's a story I want to delve into more deeply in a later episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. Instead, I want to pinpoint a different event: CART's fated 2001 race at Texas Motor Speedway. CART's rival series, the Indy Racing League, had been successfully hosting events at Texas Motor Speedway for years, but what made CART such an interesting prospect on that track was the fact that the cars were way faster. Some folks in the series, like Bobby Rahal or Kenny Brack, had run test sessions on the track and felt that it was safe. But Wally Dallenbach and CART's technical director, Kirk Russell, drove the track in a rental car and got a much different impression. They felt that when drivers would race the track flat out, they may run into issues coming off the flat straightaways onto the very sharply banked turns. Still, the race weekend went on, and in practice, drivers were hitting an absurd 232 miles per hour, not as a top speed, as an average. But early in practice, driver Cristiano D'Amata crashed in the second turn. He had no explanation for what happened, and his team could find nothing wrong with the car. Practice went on, and Maurizio Gugelmin crashed in almost the same exact spot. Gugelmin's crash was way worse, and when he hit the wall nose first, the crash recorders registered 66G. Gugelmin's car didn't stop and barreled into another wall, and that crash registered at 113G. Thankfully, he wasn't severely injured. Just like D'Amata, Gugelmin had no clue what happened. The team found no problems with the car. Telemetry showed no issues either. Observers reported that everything seemed fine until suddenly it wasn't. What the hell was going on? Practice continued on Saturday, thankfully without issue, but average speeds had climbed again to 236 miles per hour. After practice, Patrick Carpentier visited the medical unit. A few weeks previously, he had fractured his wrist, and he wanted the doctors to take a look just to see if everything was in order. But as he had his wrist inspected, Carpentier shared something interesting. He said that when he got out of his car at Texas Motor Speedway, he immediately needed to sit down in the pit wall because he was so dizzy. Dr. Olvey didn't think much of it, not until the PR director for Newman Haas Racing rushed into the medical center to report a conversation she'd overheard between Elio Castroneves and Tony Kanaan. Both drivers confessed that they felt dizzy and sick, and that in the race car, they were having a hard time keeping their bearings. As they hit mind-boggling speeds, they felt like they were spinning out of control, even as the car was pointed in a straight line. Suddenly, things clicked. Dr. Olvey recalled reading an article about fighter pilots experiencing those exact same symptoms when they were experiencing high G-loads. And if that was happening in the race cars, it was only a matter of time before something awful happened. Olvey inspected the data collected from Paul Tracy's car during practice and found that the Canadian driver was experiencing 3.5 vertical G, a kind of G-force that drivers almost never experienced under standard racing conditions. Worse, the drivers were also facing a lateral G of 5.5 in the fast corners. Olvey states in his autobiography that it wasn't uncommon for drivers to face that kind of lateral G load briefly in tight road course turns, but he'd never seen anything like it in an oval, and he'd never seen anything like it at high speed. Olvey sprung into action, reaching out to G-force expert Dr. Richard Jennings, who had been a flight director at NASA. Jennings took one look at the data and said, "You're in big trouble." Dr. Olvey went next to the bigwigs at CART with his information, and they canceled the next session out of an abundance of caution, but they weren't ready to cancel the race. Not yet. As Olvey and Jennings did more digging, it became clear that the specific G-loads that Paul Tracy had experienced in his race car had never been recorded before in medical literature. Not in fighter pilot training, not in space travel, never. Nowhere. Olvey called a meeting with all the drivers and asked if they'd experienced dizziness, vertigo, a loss of awareness, visual disturbances, nausea, vomiting, or any other weird abnormal sensations while they were driving. 18 of the 20 drivers admitted that they had those symptoms. The 2 who didn't experience the symptoms hadn't driven more than 4 consecutive laps. One driver even admitted to completely losing awareness in turn 2. When he finally felt like he came to, he was barreling into turn 3 with no idea how he got there. The driver thought he was having a stroke, but he was actually experiencing a phenomenon known as G-lock, where the intense forces exerted on a human body result in decreased blood flow to the brain. It was clear by that point that the race simply could not go on, but canceling a race would cause huge issues for CART. Tickets had been sold. People had traveled. Live television broadcasts had been arranged. Hell, even the IRL could race at Texas Motor Speedway, so it would look absurd for the more advanced CART machines to skip the race. In order to figure out what to do, Olvey sat down in a meeting with team owners, track management, and engine manufacturers that kicked off at 2 p.m. and ran until almost midnight. Everyone proposed different ideas to try to slow the cars down. But there was no real consensus about what would actually work. Teams didn't have their road course package with them in Texas, so using the track's infield road course was out of the question. If you messed with the tuning of the engines to slow the cars, you were liable to have blown units and a lot of extra unnecessary expenses. You couldn't change anything about the tires at that time, and you couldn't even really install chicanes. There was only one option. The race could not go on. By canceling the 2001 race at Texas Motor Speedway, CART made history. It was the first race series in the world to cancel an event strictly due to medical reasons. Not safety reasons, medical reasons. And that made an impact. It told the world that we could discern the root cause of a recurring driver problem, that we could pinpoint it as being related to the G-forces slamming into the human body, and that we could make proactive safety decisions. At the time, folks were not happy, but I think that's what makes the decision all the more important. CART wasn't going to wait for someone to get hurt before pulling its drivers off the track, no matter how unpopular. It valued its drivers' lives. The decision to cancel CART's 2001 event at Texas Motor Speedway was hugely unpopular in the racing community, and it spelled disaster for the series that was suddenly faced with lawsuits, complaints from disgruntled fans, and a whopping $3 million loss. Dr. Olvey's recommendation to cancel the race for medical reasons made headlines across the country. No one could believe that had happened. Well, some folks could. When Olvey returned home from TMS, he found he'd received a call from, of all places, the Pentagon. The U.S. Navy had been experimenting with something called agile jets, which could turn while in air without banking. But they were facing problems with the effects of the G-load on the pilots. They weren't sure if human beings would actually be able to fly those planes because the forces could make them lose consciousness. The tests they conducted by the Navy were being done in secret, but after Texas Motor Speedway, they could draw on Dr. Olvey's knowledge of what had happened in the race cars and project those things onto fighter pilots. With a combination of 1.5 lateral G and a very modest vertical G, the Pentagon found that the pilots were developing temporary blindness in their inside eye. In Texas, that would have meant drivers would have been unable to see and unable to adequately evaluate depth within 2 laps. of the race start. Further testing ultimately showed that when humans experience those kinds of combined G-forces, the forces impact everything from the brain to the eye to the inner ear. Drivers might have been able to compensate somewhat for a loss of vision in one eye, but the forces were still telling their inner ear that they were losing control of their cars, even though they weren't. Maurizio Gugelmin and Cristiano D'Amata crashed because their inner ear was saying that they were losing control, and the drivers responded by correcting a spin that wasn't happening. Even though the failed TMS race was a disastrous for American open wheel racing, in the aftermath, CART lost its main sponsors and big team owners, which led to bankruptcy. It did provide ample and valuable information to the overall medical world. Just think back to the start of this episode, to 1966, when trauma care didn't exist, when the medical field saw drivers as fools and not athletes, and as a result, it ignored the wealth of information the racing world could provide. Again, if you went to the racetrack, you were probably expecting at most a dingy shed to serve as a medical center, and some guy's hearse or his personal station wagon to be the emergency response vehicle. In 2001, the medical program in CART was so sophisticated and robust that drivers not only trusted the doctors they traveled with, but that those doctors were making discoveries so important that even the Pentagon needed to call on them to learn more. Motorsport had gone from being perceived as a fool's errand to being a legitimate sport that could offer massive value to the medical and scientific worlds. While we can't give all the credit for motorsport safety innovations to Dr. Stephen Olvey or even to American open wheel racing, both deserve a huge amount of respect. No track but the Indianapolis Motor Speedway had the legacy or importance to establish the robust infield medical facility, and no one but Dr. Olvey had ever tried to keep accurate, detailed notes about what kind of injuries they were treating and what kind of issues might have been causing them. Today, even if IndyCar may not be on the cutting edge of technology, it remains on the cutting edge at the safety response realm. The AMR safety team, as it's known today, consists of 30 safety personnel, with a minimum of 18 of those people attending each event. There must be one trauma physician, one orthopedics physician, 2 paramedics, 2 registered nurses, and 12 firefighters or EMTs on hand. The team travels with 4 state-of-the-art Homoltro safety vehicles that feature top-tier technology, as well as with a recently refurbished mobile medical unit featuring 2 hospital beds, x-ray machines, a resuscitation cart, orthopedic care supplies, and even video feeds for the staff to monitor on-track action, and 4 different areas for consultation. The safety crew itself can reach an accident in as little as 30 seconds by building on the processes implemented by Dr. Olvey years ago. And because the safety staff know their way around a race car, extrication takes moments. All because a few dedicated volunteers decided that race car drivers deserve the same quality of life and care as everyone else. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. In the next show, we'll be diving into the story of Rajo Jack, one of the pioneering black racers in American motorsport who made waves in the quote-unquote outlaw race series of pre-World War II. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, leave it a review, and if you're hungry for more, head over to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve into contemporary motorsport news, as well as a newsletter rounding up the biggest events you should be paying attention to. Plus, if you want to send an email, I've got an address, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. DPTJ may only be in its first season, but we have already crowned 2 stunning world champions. I want to give a special shout out to Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington, both of whom have gone above and beyond to support this podcast. It takes a lot of work to make any of these episodes happen, but with the support of people like Ryan and Nicole in my corner, it makes it so much easier to bring episodes out to the audience. I also want to read a great comment I received from @ACHC2FK on YouTube, who wrote of the video on Achille Varzi, quote, Good to see a video about the most overlooked of the great Grand Prix drivers, and he truly was great. I find him to be the single most fascinating character to have driven a racing car. I don't disagree. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel and stock up on some incredible motorsport merch. And don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find a full list of sources in the episode description. This week, my primary source was Dr. Stephen Olvey's autobiography, Rapid Response, My Inside Story as a Motor Racing Lifesaver. It's an honestly incredible book, and it delves into the creation of the series' groundbreaking medical team and all of the little innovations that came up along the way. There's also a documentary on the exact same subject called Yellow, 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 and while it is a great film, I'd advise a little bit of caution if you're squeamish. The documentary does include footage of fatal accidents, so watch at your own risk. I've also referenced a lot of critical care manuals and studies that I spoke about in this episode, which are all linked in the description below. Thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to see you next time for another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.